Two. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. We want to welcome you to today's Container Journal panel discussion brought to you by the TechStrong Group. My name is Jared Harris, and I'll be your host for today's event. We've got an exciting panel ahead of you, but before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded. You'll receive an email shortly after today's webinar concludes with a link to access the recording. If you have any questions, we'd like you to submit them using the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. This is also where you will find the chat tab. You can engage with the speakers, you can engage with other audience members, let us know where you're from. Finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, we'll be giving out 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around and see if you're a winner. Let's go ahead and kick off today's discussion with Kubernetes security. We're joined today with Rachel Sweeney, Insights Enablement Engineer at Fairwinds, Matt Bader, Principal Solutions Enablement Architect at Veeam. We've got John King, Senior Sales Engineer at StrongVM, and Matt Johnson, Developer Advocate at Prisma Cloud. It's my pleasure to turn the program over to you, Mike Bazard, to get today's program started. I'll be turning my webcam off. Go ahead and begin.
All right. Hey, folks, thanks for joining us. This is going to be an awesome event because we're talking about Kubernetes one more time, but this time we're diving in on the security issues with some folks that have been around it for a long time. And I guess that's where my first question is going to start with. We have been talking about Kubernetes, some of us at least, for 6 years, maybe longer, depending on how far you've been in this business. And yet it feels like to me a little bit, security, once again, is a little bit of an afterthought. So Matt, what is going on with Kubernetes and security, and why does it feel like, once again, the security folks are at the back end of the parade?
Sure. I think it goes back to like every other technology we see in our industry. It's that security versus usability slider, which always by default ends up kind of on the wrong side. You hear of containerization, in the media and things as being a way of keeping everything separate. So maybe there's a little bit of learning as well. When people come into containers, they think it kind of solves a lot of those traditional security issues. And in reality, it doesn't. It just changes the security issues you need to think about. But they're still very much there. And obviously, you go and look at anything online for a Hello World example, which is the kind of most common thing I see as issues. And all those Hello World examples are designed to be easy. They're not designed to be secure, but that doesn't stop them getting kind of copied and pasted into people's production clusters.
You guys generally agree with that, Rachel? I'm going to pose this to you because there's some folks, we live in a world full of conspiracy, so I'll share the conspiracy of the theory of the day. And part of that theory goes something like this. It's like, look, Kubernetes was so hard as it was just to set up and configure that no one wanted to take on the security issue up front because they were afraid that they would just, people would run screaming into the night if they had to take on the security side of that as well. So did we kind of deliberately sidestep the security thing for later because Kubernetes was kind of difficult in the first place?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, as soon as we entered the Kubernetes space, there was a shift, like Matt was saying, about how we do things and how we configure them. And there's a lot of unknown things that, new engineers who are working their way up the learning curve of using Kubernetes just don't know. Like, do we have the host IPC disabled on every single workload we have in the cluster? And why should we care about that? That's one of those little tiny advanced things that could make an impact, if things are compromised. And so I think that's one of the challenges, is just that there are all these new unknowns. The learning curve can be steep. And additionally, there's not a ton of Kubernetes talent out there. And so the talent that is out there is very expensive. And so for a lot of companies, just getting things up and running and it's working, the product team is happy, the dev team's happy. That's a huge feat unto itself before you have all the other security, toggles that you need to change. So.
All right. We're getting a little bit of a feedback loop from somewhere, so I apologize for that, but let's figure out as we go along. Matt, do you agree with that? Do you think the security folks have been left out of this equation, or just now starting to show up?
I think it's also just a question of who the security folks are now, right? We talk about containerization almost going hand in hand with this concept of shift left, which puts so much more in the laps of developers with respect to new responsibilities. So to Rachel's point around, having the right kind of education, I think for those additional teams that are now touching this is really important. I believe Canonical, this past year, 2021, they had a Kubernetes and cloud native operations survey that they had put out. That was north of 50% of the respondents, like their number one issue with adoption across the board is lack of skill set. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, John, let me ask you about that, since he brought up the dreaded shift left question. Are we asking too much of folks to shift so much responsibility left? I mean, we talk about full stack, and in theory, that includes developers who are going to be able to take care of security, and we talk about DevSecOps, but the number of full stack developers seem to be relatively low in this world, and I may not be that high ever. So my question to you is, do we need to rethink how we manage security, but can we really shift everything so far left that developers are going to run everything?
That's a good question. I would say that, to go back to one of the earlier questions, like security is hard, right? This is no easy thing to do. And one of the things that we run up against is the good enough problem. Like, you deploy it, you're up and running, you get some basic security in place, and then you just move on to the next project, right? And that's one of the challenges that I see with, these DevSecOps types of models, where if you're trying to shift left, you got to be careful. There's a fine line between good enough and operations and getting your production teams up and running, and then also making sure that you're being able to manage it correctly from a security aspect.
Matt, I want to ask you, Matt Johnson, I want to ask you the same question with a slightly different perspective, though. Is it fair to shift it all the way left to developers, or should we figure out how to put this in the DevSecOps workflow or the DevOps workflow? Because when I talk to developers, they're like, well, they didn't want to go out of their way to build an insecure application, but they do have a few thousand other things on their mind, and security isn't always at the top of the list. So they would look to you and say, it's your job, Mr. IT organization, to figure out this security issue, not necessarily my number one job. So does all this need to get into the workflow somehow?
Yeah. So glad you kind of brought up the shift left thing, because I wanted to jump in on that anyway. I think,
I could see you itching over there. So.
I've worked in kind of containers since, there were Solaris branded zones, and I consider myself a security practitioner. And even I couldn't tell you what's on every page of like the Kubernetes CIS 1.6 guidelines. And technically that's my full-time job. So yeah, it's not right for a developer to be, expected to take on all that security responsibility. But I think shift left almost can be like, in my opinion, it's more about like, tooling left, because those developers are already doing the deployments, right? Whether they're thinking about security or not, DevOps kind of enables development teams to create their own infrastructure to self-serve. So they are going to be the ones already writing the deployment YAML, potentially, deploying applications. And with that responsibility to move quicker, there does need to be the responsibility of thinking of the security aspects. Just in the same way that development teams used to be given access to VMs, or self-provision that, you still need to think about security. Should we be providing them the tools to make that easier, and to kind of give them that almost virtual security assistant, like as part of their regular day-to-day workflow, so that they don't have to scratch their heads and even work out what to read in the CIS benchmarks? Yeah, we need to try and help them automate as much of that with guardrails as possible. But I think it's going to be inevitable that there is going to have to be a bit of security, on that development function. Otherwise, that team shouldn't really be writing those deployment manifests in the first place, if that makes sense.
It does, in the sense that we're trying to strike a balance between shifting left and maybe having the rest of the organization lean a little more left. And so we're in the middle somewhere. But I guess I'll ask Rachel, Is it your sense that I do those things at the same time, or should I start with one, like far left of the developers first, and then work through the workflows and the ops side second, or the other way around? I do it in the guardrails and the ops side first, and then I educate the developers on how to write better code.
Yeah, good question. I think organically it's probably going to happen so that they both kind of just happen. You know, if you have that benefit of foresight, maybe you will set up a lot of the things on the ops side first before rolling it out to the developers. And we certainly do see organizations that do that. They'll, you know, trial different tools, set up guardrails and open policy agent configurations. And then that way, as soon as the dev team is ready to onboard, then they already have these, you know, checks in place that will prevent them from shooting themselves in the foot. And I think it is a situation where, you know, it kind of is something that it's going to require all the teams to work on, because for a lot of the things that the developers are writing that end up in a Kubernetes cluster, there might be certain things in that deployment YAML manifest that need to be enabled that you don't want enabled on a separate deployment. And so I think in that situation, you know, to a degree, they're going to need to know a little bit about the infrastructure that they're running on, insofar as they know that, like, my app needs this particular ability, which is by default turned off, or I think in Kubernetes they're generally turned on by default, but you should lock them down so they're off by default, you know, from an organizational standpoint, and then the dev team can flip it on if they need it. So,
Matt, she brings up this great point, and I've talked to people about this before, where there are security controls in Kubernetes. They're just, a lot of them are not turned on by default. So people, because there's so many bells and whistles, they never find these things. Do you have any advice for how should I go about creating these new, more secure workflows? Do I just take everybody and lock them in a room and hope something good happens? Or is there a smarter way to think about this? And of course, I meant that Matt B. I'm going to go with Matt
okay.
B.
I was going to say, I think Matt J might have a more compelling answer to this based on his area of focus. But I think that's specifically because the answer here is definitely going to be routed in policy and specifically. I know one of the topics that we'll probably get into in terms of doing and maintaining these environments at scale is ultimately going to be doing that with infrastructure as code and policy as code. Matt, I don't know if you'd like to add more color commentary on top of that.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think as kind of Rachel said as well, like with infrastructure as code, with treating your infrastructure like your software, you have the opportunity to maybe do a bit of reconnaissance first. You can drop tools into your CI pipeline to kind of get an idea of the posture of your existing set of deployments and start working out how big the issue is going to be for developers before starting to think about actually kind of shifting left those alerts and things to developers. But for example, we have an open source VS Code plugin for our Chekhov tool. And so that actually highlights Kubernetes misconfigurations. Like you said, there's a lot of security checkboxes you can just turn on. But in a previous presentation, like the slide always got a laugh where we kind of show a minimum deployment of a working Nginx container. And it's about this long in Kubernetes YAML. And then we show a secure one that does exactly the same thing, but that passes CIS 1.6, and it literally goes off the page. So it's knowing the things you don't know to enable within those manifests. And that's what we're trying to enable either in CI or in VS Code or just in places that help the developer rather than expecting them to go and find documentation.
All right. John, how big an issue do you think this really is? And I'm asking the question because maybe I've been doing this too long, but no matter what survey I put out there for whatever topic, and I ask the question, what's the biggest challenge? Security comes back as the answer. Doesn't matter what it is. It could be ERP, it could be Kubernetes, it could be tying my shoes. It's all the same. So, are people just, kind of having a knee-jerk reaction about security in Kubernetes like everything else, or is there something specific about security in the context of Kubernetes that makes it more difficult for people, and these are the things they should be looking out for?
Yeah, I think when you look at misconfiguration, that's the biggest thing that I see in misconfiguration at scale. It's one thing to have a couple clusters, a few teams that are associated to it, and you have a couple bespoke configurations in your YAML file. We'll blow that up when you have hundreds of users trying to access clusters that are distributed across every cloud platform, right? So, yeah, it scale, it definitely blows up. It's something that you have to take into consideration. It is, a very serious matter. When you have containers that could be spun up outside of the visibility of the orchestration that Kubernetes is doing, there's just so many different aspects. I think one of the things that we tend to minimize or we don't think of enough is runtime security. Just making sure that we're looking at things not just from the configuration and the YAML file level, but are my containers secure, or is there anything else that we need to take into consideration?
All right. Well, all right, so this is my pet peeve, and I'm just going to throw it back at you, John. So we just talked about shift left, and we're talking about we're moving everything over to left hand of the developers, and we're going to have full stack developers. And yet our number one problem is misconfiguration. So we wake up in the morning and we're surprised by this, or what? Is there a way to think about getting in front of those misconfigurations that are clearly done mostly by developers using infrastructure as code type tools, and getting the security people in that conversation in a way that doesn't slow down the whole process? Or is that just impossible?
It's not impossible, but it's definitely going to be a challenge, right? I think the biggest thing here is not just the configuration of Kubernetes, but how people access it and which people access it, and are they authorized to access it, and trying to marry up some of the common tools that we're using, whether it's IAM or other types of single sign-on, where we can actually say, okay, I have a one-to-one mapping between this user and this configuration, and now I can templatize this. I can control, policies, who gets to access these things, and that's really what it comes down to: is who has access to do things to this cluster, and do you want to control that? And the answer should obviously be yes.
All right. Anybody else have any issues besides misconfiguration that's their number one, or something maybe even 2 or 3, Rachel, that when you think about Kubernetes and security that people should really be looking out for?
I think one that a lot of people struggle with is network policies in general. When we were just in virtual machines before, we had firewalls, security groups, whatever you want to call them, depending on which cloud you're in. And I feel like we did a pretty good job of locking those down between each other. But now that we're in the Kubernetes space, by default, all pods can communicate with all other pods. So they can send ingress, egress traffic back and forth. And we probably don't want most of those, like 99% of those things don't need to be talking to each other. And so setting up network policies is something that we can do to only allow certain traffic through. But it's also a challenging thing to do. And for so many companies that are, happy to just get things up and running and scaling in Kubernetes, taking this extra step and doing that it can cause a lot of headaches. There can be difficulty around visibility, like why isn't this getting through when it should be? And it's just another hurdle that we have to tackle. From all the unofficial polls I've seen, I think most people are not using network policies. There's certainly more people, moving in that direction, but I still think we have a ways to go there.
Right. Matt B, got any favorite Kubernetes security bugaboos?
So I would say not necessarily the top of the pile, but certainly another relevant one that maybe ties together some themes from what John and Rachel shared is this idea that, okay, I am refactoring some existing application. I've got net new Kubernetes infrastructure that this is being deployed into. I didn't just sweep my data center floor clean with everything that came before it, right? I still have all of these legacy tools and systems in place, and many of which I might want to or need to for one motivation or another have to integrate with that now cloud native focused project. Not to sound like a shield here, but data protection is conceivably one of those, where if you've got solutions that are built for traditional virtualization and don't speak native Kubernetes, like using like RBAC APIs would be an example of this. And then how do I develop that all-in-one sort of authorization solution between What I'm still going to carry forward, conceivably for months or years in my traditional virtualized environment and my new and shiny.
Mm-hmm. And then Matt J, what do you got? Anything in there? Or are you good with the other three?
Yeah, I think one thing I see is the kind of importance of tying those misconfigurations into, I know supply chain's a buzzword right now, but commonly, older images, using latest, not having control over what images are being used in your pods, and then thinking about what the kind of potential vulnerabilities in those pods. So kind of coupling image scanning with misconfigurations can be really nasty from a security posture, because not only maybe you're exposing something you shouldn't through misconfigured or non-existent network policies, but then the pod you're running has some pretty serious CVEs in it as well. So that's a recipe for disaster. So I think more kind of visibility of all of these things. We shouldn't have one team looking at CVEs and images, one team looking at misconfigurations. The whole kind of Swiss cheese model of is this something which could be affected and lead to an attack, like that whole blast radius thing, is something I'm kind of excited to see get more developed as a security industry.
John, is there some other way about thinking about who should be in charge of all this stuff? Because sometimes I feel like when I look at it, the developers think that the security people are going to catch the ball. The security people think that the IT ops people are going to catch the ball. And, and then the ball lands for a single for the bad guys because, the second baseman and the shortstop and the center fielder each thought somebody else was going to catch the ball. So is there another way of thinking about the way we're organized to kind of make this more of a cohesive effort, or is it always just going to be, in some ways, we're kind of our own worst enemy because of the way we're organized?
Well, I mean, the word that you keep popping up and saying is organized, and if you look at it from an organizational perspective, we have all kinds of organizations, whether they're legacy, older, they come from the traditional method of deploying IT applications, or you have more of the newer organizations, a little bit more nimble. So the challenge there is no one shoe fits everybody, right? You really have to be looking at it on a per organization basis, because the way that each organization rolls out their own policies, their own rules around how things are from a workflow perspective, it's a really hard question to answer, because it really is bespoke per organization, and hopefully some organizations are further along in that development, but by and large it's a pretty mixed bag.
All right, Rachel, you guys provide managed services, and this may be a little directly in your wheelhouse, but I'm going to ask it anyway. At what point do some people just look at you and decide to punt because of all these organizational issues, and they're like, let's just go find somebody else to manage all this stuff? And and what makes somebody decide to not manage it themselves versus continuing to manage it themselves?
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen organizations that are newer in the Kubernetes space wanting to go with a managed solution first. And then from there, they'll slowly build up confidence and just understand how more and more things work. But at the end of the day, you still have to have like developer involvement, or we need to work with those teams to know what types of which security flags we can turn on or off, or which things they might need access to. Because, there are things that are going to need to, like, if you look at stuff like a lot of logging software requires access to the Docker socket underlying the nodes. And so that's not an ideal situation, but at the end of the day, you need that in order for that tool to function. And so for a lot of organizations, depending on what they're building and how it needs to use the infrastructure that it's sitting on, they can't just punt all of those decisions. You can certainly get a stable platform out of the gate that's going to encrypt secrets. We'll probably have like a private API endpoint, so you have to be on a certain network. There's a lot of things you can do to set up, but at the end of the day, there's only so much you can punt. So.
All right. So no matter, even if I punt, I still have to be involved, and I have to know how it works. And if I decide that I'm going to switch something out, I need to understand the implications of that. Matt J, outside of Kubernetes, we've been talking as an industry now about DevSecOps forever and a day, or almost as long as Kubernetes. Do you think that as we look at Kubernetes and we see how it evolves, that this becomes the tipping point that forces people down that DevSecOps path, because all these things do need to be approached as a team sport, as it were?
Yeah, I think just the size of what we're trying to do these days, the scale we're operating at, the fact that, as Matt B's alluded to, we're generally not running one cluster. We kind of want, 10, 100, like very similar, very, same configuration clusters. I think that alone is going to force us down the at least kind of GitOps, DevOps side of cluster creation and management. And then at that point, with everything being codified, it becomes a lot easier to have, a shorter time to a kind of a shorter, easier conversation between DevOps and security, and then codify those security policies into your kind of cluster environment. In a perfect world, obviously. But yeah, I don't think it will sadly happen because of security in particular. As you said, we've been saying that security has been an issue for years and years and years with VMs and then bare metal. But I do think the scale of what we're doing and the fact that the only way to deal with that scale is automation means that that is a good position to be in for trying to solve some of these, especially the low-hanging fruit kind of everyday common issues we see with Kubernetes security.
All right. I'm going to jump into some of the questions here in the Q&A, and I'm going to skip Matt B's, but I appreciated the response. But if we have a question here, and it's kind of a simple question, but maybe not such an easy answer. Where do you go to learn about Kubernetes security? Because there's a lot of people who are just starting out and they're listening to this. And what would you recommend would be the first place to go? I'll start with Rachel.
Yeah, so for me, there's a few things. There's a number of tools out there, like there's the open source tool Polaris, which shows best practices for configuration. And at my previous job, when I was first getting started with Kubernetes, that was a good way for me to learn which of these configurations should I actually care about, and learning more that way. Additionally, as I wanted to get deeper into the why and get more advanced, there's a lot of great talks from KubeCon from previous years, especially if you look at some of the big players in like the SIG security space. They've given a lot of great talks on different things that are very helpful for just, understanding all the different areas. Unfortunately, there's not, I wish there was a single resource I could point someone to, but for me personally, there's a lot of great talks on YouTube, and there's a lot of great tools that you can use, and then figuring out the why behind those.
All right. Anybody else got any favorite recommendations?
I would say also a lot of the training across the board available through the Linux Foundation directly. It's one of those things I've paid for out of pocket for probably the better part of 10 years. And a lot of it just because of how hands-on a lot of those courses become. I think most everyone in this space learns and retains the most through doing. I think of myself as a big hands-on lab nerd in terms of how I do, build a lot of my own enablement materials for our, sales engineers or partners internally. And I think Linux Foundation does a really great job of that.
All right.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that, not so much external training, but the importance of building your own organization and having different levels of skill sets, right? So we have a younger person or less experienced person that can go work up chain, talk to somebody who's in a different department, but that inter-organizational training is really important. So when you're developing and building your teams, making sure that you're pretty well rounded and that you have that internal support so that you have internal growth.
John, let me ask you a question about this as an extension, but do you think it's worth the time and effort to go get a certificate in, say, specifically Kubernetes security, or do you think certificates are worthwhile in general? Because there's always a lot of debate and a lot of feeling about that one way or the other. But do you think that folks should go that route, or is it just a matter of hands-on training, get the experience, and away you go?
I think that's a personal decision. If you're comfortable with getting the experience and moving on, then go for it. But some folks do like to have that achievement factor that a certificate provides. So it's not so much a mandatory thing, but it's more of a personal thing. So when you make that decision, whether or not you're going to go take a class or pay for the certification process, it's very much an individual's choice.
All right. Everybody agree with that?
Wholeheartedly.
Yeah. Personally, for me, I always look at exams with the number of people failing or saying they're going for a retake on social media, and I kind of think of those ones more positively than the ones that you only hear of people passing. And certainly with the Kubernetes security exam, that definitely seems to be one that requires a couple of retakes. So I should imagine it will give you a proper test of your skills.
I don't hear many people passing the Kubernetes test on any level.
Right.
On the first go, all that easy. I think maybe you could become a lawyer might be easier in some instances, but what do I know? The other thing that I would kind of start to poke at a little bit, though, is like, all right, so we're looking at all this stuff and we're trying to figure out how to manage it at scale. And so is there a difference, John, let's go with you here. Is there a difference between trying to manage, say, 1 or 2 Kubernetes clusters and kind of trying to secure those? And now, you start to see clusters at the edge, you start to see them in the cloud, they're in on-premise environments. Do I need to think about Kubernetes security differently at scale?
You do if you want to manage it correctly. Absolutely. It's when you're a small team and you just grant everybody cluster admin role binding, it's kind of like to get their job done. That's one thing. When you're dealing with teams that are geographically dispersed across every continent, you have clusters on every continent. Okay, how do I manage that? Not only just from an onboarding perspective, they just joined the company, how do I get them access to the infrastructure quickly without really, getting in the way of them being able to do their jobs? And I think that's the biggest problem is really around the access management piece of it, being able to onboard them, get them access to their tools, get them up and running, but also making sure that you're, auditing everything that they're doing from an observability standpoint and controlling their access. Are they authorized to actually touch the things that they're supposed to be touching? Those are all things that, when you get to a scale question, it becomes a lot more important to be done correctly.
Right. Matt J., are you seeing challenges on that front? How much are you seeing people trying to actually manage Kubernetes security at that level of scale?
Yeah, security, the scale is definitely an issue. Even things that don't seem security related become security or at least uptime related, we've seen, when you're doing at scale. So a case in an example I always use, if you're using multi-tenant clusters, you're not using kind of a cluster per tool or per team. Things that might not seem security related, like setting CPU and memory limits on every pod, suddenly actually impact the uptime of your cluster, because without those, it would allow random team A, to completely saturate that cluster and potentially starve other products and teams of resources. So, lots of things that you need to think about when you're looking at, like you said, those bigger disconnected, disjointed teams.
All right. Rachel, you got anything to add about managing security at scale?
Yeah, those are all great points. And I think this is where we start to see the admission controller being used more and more in Kubernetes. Now we're getting into that policy as code situation. And, from that reliability standpoint, we might just say that you cannot deploy in this cluster unless you have memory requests and limits set. Same thing with CPU, because that way, you don't want somebody taking up more resources and bringing down something critical. And same thing with all the different security checks.
Right.
You might say that we do not allow as an organization any images to come from Docker Hub because there's so much insecure stuff out there. And, it has to go through our internal registry that we vetted, and then that's what's allowed into the cluster. And so I think as scale grows and as more organizations start to deal with that, that's where they start to put those policies in place, which is unfortunately another layer of complication and complexity that you have to throw into the mix.
All right, Matt B., I want to come to a topic that's in your wheelhouse for a couple of minutes. I think I was at my first conference where somebody talked about security and data protection need to converge 25 years ago. I'm counting back now. And it didn't happen then. And then we heard, there was all these ransomware attacks and we needed to converge more of security and data protection. And it happens maybe a little bit more, but not to the degree that most people would hope for or even think about. So do you think that as we move to Kubernetes and things are much more dynamic, that we'll finally get there, and will this help have that conversation? And why doesn't this happen as much as it should?
No, it'll all be fine. I'm just kidding. Yeah, Mike, of course. So yeah, with ransomware as a top, if not the top, sort of concern for just about every organization. Your backup data is a prime target for these bad actors. So that in and of itself should make data protection part of every organization's security posture. And I think that comes with its own kind of set of best practices that fit into some of the themes that we've already talked about, and I think can become a reality in a cloud native world. So we talked about how DevSecOps, like this could finally become a thing. Same idea here, in terms of leveraging tools like Kubernetes RBAC. So just making sure, again, following my own best practices, making sure I'm only allowing the right people access to that backup data. Thinking about it from a storage perspective, are we putting all of this on immutable storage to protect that target against tampering or deletion? But going back to where we started some of this around shifting left, and how do we shift left maybe without shifting so much of the responsibility? This is an area where we're really focused on now of how do we build, with tools like OPA or Falco or others, how do we build data protection guardrails into Kubernetes? So we're able to give people, not just the hello world example of how to protect an application, but give them the hello world plus, making sure that, whether it's from a GitOps perspective, when I'm checking in this code, that part of my, my infrastructure as code definition for this application meets my corporate policy standards for, hey, this is going to be snapshotted every so often. Here's my retention policy. This is required to be on immutable storage, and whether it's pushing back at check-in time or automating some of those fixes. Again, using tools like OPA is incredibly important, so that now we can take developers who, again, might not know or even necessarily care about their operations RPO or RTO standards, but are still able to ensure that everything they're pushing, from dev into production is still protected.
Do you think that the tenor of that conversation needs to change as well? And I'm going to ask it from this perspective. So back in the day, you kind of backed up things. Maybe, hopefully, you tested it and you were like, okay, this is going to be awesome, and it'll may or may not work when the time comes. But if it worked, you were happy. But it seems like in these cloud native environments that are much more dynamic, the actual recovery point and the recovery time objective is a lot more important, because I need that to happen as quickly or borderline instantaneously as possible. So do we need more focus on what the recovery process is going to look like?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I'm sure there are probably people joined in on this call right now that have sat through some very long, painful Saturday, Sunday afternoon that they've spent DR testing once a year, twice a year, for infrastructure and code that might only, again, change once a year or twice a year. So that's how often we need to validate and sort of ensure compliance for these things. Yeah, in a cloud native environment where that app, I could have dozens or hundreds or thousands of changes to that production application conceivably in a day or over some short period of time. You need the ability to, obviously not just to be able to recover quickly, but validate. Yeah, I could easily spin up a new EKS cluster or OpenShift cluster, whatever it happens to be, and go through, maybe whatever transforms that need to take place there, and ensure that I can get up and running. Or again, leveraging this, with more and more stateful applications being run on Kubernetes, the dependencies there just for supporting things like dev test workflows, where I, as a developer, might need to rapidly, spin up this entire stack for cluster and application, but working from, 5 minutes ago production data. Everything gets faster. Data protection absolutely needs to follow suit.
All right. John, let me ask you something. You can't walk down the proverbial IT street today without somebody talking about AI. As we look at all this complexity, do you think at some point that maybe AI will save us from ourselves, or is that too much wishful thinking?
Well, in order for it to work correctly, you need to have an actual good baseline. So who decides what the baseline is? How do you start training your models around this is the accepted whatever, and then look at behavior or whatever type of detection you want to use AI or ML for. It's funny because AI is thrown around a lot, but in reality, it's just a bunch of machine learning baselines where you're trying to identify things. So I guess to boil down that answer, it's really what is the baseline and how do you get to that baseline?
All right. Matt J., you want to add anything to that? I mean, they're just, everyday common algorithms. You can get them anywhere, right? But,
Right. And I think, yeah, to quote Matt B, it'll be fine. We're already seeing companies kind of use AI and training models based on thousands of this was a broken cluster, this was a healthy cluster, and using it to kind of preempt failures or misconfigurations or clusters that are about to crash. So I'm sure we'll see some of that move into the security space, and I'm sure some budding startup will do a similar model for security misconfigurations. But I think to what John was alluding to there as well, what is a good policy that's going to change depending on each company, each business unit, the risk reward value of what they're trying to protect and what that cluster is running. You're never going to have a single answer across the industry for that. So I'm not sure how useful that's going to be.
All right, we will see. Cross our fingers and hope for the best from here. Hey, folks, it's time to play Queens and Kings, as they say. So, Rachel, we'll start with you. You have now been appointed officially Queen of the Technical Oversight Committee for Kubernetes, and you can fix anything you want with the wave of the wand. So what's that one thing you would focus on or say, hey, let's fix this immediately?
That's tough. I'm just going to throw two out real quick. One would be network policies, like if they were just all in place instantly, easy to use. And the other is policy. I don't think anybody loves writing policy or is like, that was a lot easier than I thought it would be. And then off to the races they go. So I think those two things, if I could just wave a wand and have it be fixed, those would be some high value things I'd love to see.
All right, policies. John, let's shift to you. You're a king of the Technical Oversight Committee. What are you going to fix on the security front?
Man, make RBAC easier. Going back to the policies, right? There's just so many opportunities for configuration drift, and it's just to make it easier to deploy at scale. That would be my biggest thing is really focus on making RBAC more understandable, have visibility into how it's being applied, making sure that there's not duplicates and templates, bringing people into the cluster and taking them out of the cluster easily and not leaving any relics behind. There's just the RBAC model is definitely the one.
All right. Matt J., what are you going to fix?
I think we're like, to Matt B's point on needing policies that again aren't necessarily security but are around like data security. I think luckily we do have the tools there that we can write policies for those that will be scanned in the same tools we already have for security policies, so that it's just a case of writing the policies, which is a pain. So I'm not going to use my kingly crown to fix that. I have more of like I think we as a community need to be holding ourselves to a higher standard. And I think a lot of the problems right now, for example, I cannot find a single cluster kind of distributed storage solution which isn't using pod security policies in their Helm charts. And those were depreciated versions ago. You know, I shouldn't be already littering my new cluster with things like that for kind of core pieces or core accessories for my new Kubernetes clusters. And so, you know, just in the same way we kind of scan Artifact Hub for CVEs, I'd like to see us not allow people to publish things to Artifact Hub if they have any misconfigurations and things like that. And just generally kind of practicing what we preach as a community, especially with the more kind of commonly used online resources.
All right. Matt B., I know you wanted to be king your whole life, so this is your moment.
So first order of business, I would remove Kubernetes king term limits, so I could remove so I could remain Kubernetes king in perpetuity.
This is now a dictatorship, people.
The most. This is how democracy ends. But I think above and beyond that, multi-tenancy. So I guess building on what John was saying, not just from an RBAC perspective, but even including some of the non-traditional security aspects, like Matt mentioned, around CPU and memory limits, data protection. How do I make multi-tenancy across multiple services on a cluster easier for users? I think would be my number one thing.
All right. We also have a lot of folks, and it's not surprising, who are relatively new to Kubernetes watching this event. So let me start with Rachel. You've seen a lot of deployments. What's the kind of one thing you see people doing and you shake your head and you go, I wish they wouldn't do that, or it's a rookie mistake? And, what's that one thing that maybe give people a little bit of a leg up on?
Yeah, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that people just don't configure, like what Matt was saying about regular Nginx might be this, but then with all the security things in place, it's this. And things like, allowing privilege escalation is set to true. And, for 99% of workloads, it really doesn't need to be true. And so that's a low-hanging fruit that you could change. Having the file system be read-only, stuff like that. I think those are some of the most common ones that we see that most people today could probably just toggle off, and it would be a little bit more secure. And that's pretty much all the work they'd have to do.
All right. John, rookie mistakes. You see anything out there?
Yeah, that's what Rachel just mentioned is what I like to call the good enough model. It's like you got it most of the way there, but you got other things on your plate, so you move on. The networking piece of it is a big one. So again, I think, from Rachel made a comment earlier around the networking policies. Networking is one of those things like, did you write it correctly? Is it working as expected? How do you have visibility in how that's working when you go to test that policy? I would say, making sure that when you write your rules, you actually do test that, you're not just assuming it's going to work. That assumption that things work without testing them is a big one.
All right, Matt J., what do you see?
I was answering a question in the Q&A and completely missed that, I'll be honest.
All right. The question is, what rookie mistake do you see people constantly making? And you go, geez, I wish that they would be further down the path, because, we do have a lot of folks here who are probably brand new to Kubernetes.
Yeah, I think it's that you have to move quick. So you kind of take the information you can find at face value. security is always going to come second. And, it's not a magic bullet. Deploying Kubernetes doesn't magically secure our applications. It doesn't protect your data. It doesn't even protect itself from going down and taking all your nodes with it if you're not careful. So it is one of those things that does need attention putting into it, and time to investigate and test and kind of have a strategy and a backup plan, just like any other piece of critical infrastructure. I think people just assuming that because we're all talking about it and because it's everywhere, it's just a really solid, easy to stand up thing. And for sure, the UX is getting better, but we're not there yet. We're not there at a zero touch, hands off cluster just runs happily ever after.
All right, Matt B, rookie mistakes. What do you see people doing?
Yeah, so building off of Matt's answer is lack of chaos engineering, right? I've gone and read everything that I think I've tracked down all of the right answers, or I'm bringing in a more skilled partner to help guide me down that path. Is another great shortcut there, but not taking anything for granted, and just trying to break everything you can.
All right. I remember watching a sports interview where the reporter asked the fellow whose team had just lost, and they said, well, why do you think did you lose? And they listed all these things, and the guy looked at him finally and basically said, well, I think the other team had something to do with it. So, Rachel, speaking of the other team, are the bad guys getting better at targeting Kubernetes and containers in general? I mean, because a lot of folks you talk to, developers are like, yeah, my container's only going to run for a few seconds and nobody knows about this Kubernetes stuff, so nobody will catch me. It'll be all fine. Do you think that the bad guys are getting savvier about Kubernetes?
Yeah, I definitely think they are. I mean, I think everyone's getting savvier about Kubernetes. And while there probably are some people targeting it in particular, I'm sure what happens is there are attackers who, are just constantly probing for exploits, and they find one, and next thing they know, they're like, okay, what's this environment I'm in? And before they know it, they realize they're in a Kubernetes cluster, and then maybe they've, been able to exploit that before, maybe they haven't, but there's a lot of great YouTube videos, again, on like how to exploit Kubernetes clusters. Like I think at ShmooCon in 2020, there was somebody, I can't remember who it was, that gave a really good talk on how to think about, how to escalate privileges, how do you move laterally in a Kubernetes cluster, and there's just so many resources out there for how to start looking for those weaknesses. And so, yeah, I think those resources are just easier to find.
All right. John, do you think it's too easy now for the bad guys to find out what they need to know, and are they coming?
Oh yeah, they've always been coming. They're never going to stop, and the reason is, host-based security is important. At the end of the day, underneath those nodes, underneath those containers, you have an operating system of some kind that can be compromised, and then you're going to have lateral movement, and being able to look at it holistically, like the endpoint detection and response is really important in that type of model. You need to be able to see the attackers moving, right? And you need to have some type of orchestration that's able to alert on that. So it's not just Kubernetes, it's all host-based systems and network-based systems.
Matt J, what do you think?
Yeah, I think anything with an API, this goes back to when we moved to infrastructure as a service as well. You no longer have to be in the data center. The entire data center is just a REST call away. That makes it super easy for attackers to kind of automate, investigate, run scripts to work out what the situation is of each environment they find. But also the growing popularity, like you get more hackers hacking Android and iPhone because that's realistically what's going to be out there in the market. So yeah, I think we're just going to see more and more of it. And so again, security is, you can't hide behind the obscurity of Kubernetes just because people in your organization don't know what Kubernetes is. As has been pointed out by like the ShmooCon stuff, like the hackers are very much further ahead with this kind of stuff.
All right, Matt B., what do you think? I mean, at least from my perspective, I don't even think you have to be a rocket scientist to launch anything these days.
No, well, yeah, especially not with all of the different kits that are being distributed. But these groups care about primarily two things, right? It's profit and prestige. So profit likely takes precedent of where we can go make money the fastest and easiest. And I think, at this point in time, we're seeing maybe more of a trend towards crypto jacking more than ransomware. But that's not to say that prestige is not still a huge motivator, again, to try and take down some household name corporations' operations, many of which are born in the cloud companies to begin with. So all they run is containerized workloads.
All right. I'm going to come back to Matt J. here for this next question. It seems to me, at least, that the bad guys do a lot better job collaborating than the good guys. And, have we gotten to the point where maybe because of the complexity of Kubernetes that the good guys might actually get together and share best practices and defenses and actually have a common conversation for a change? Or is that just wishful thinking?
I think that is happening. I think it's more the fact that the only time we see the bad guys, like, they don't actually have a product to keep running. They don't have any uptime or any customers or any shareholders to worry about in the same way. So I think, we hear a lot more about the bad guys doing all that stuff because that's all they have to do. I do think the work like the SIG Security is doing, the Kubernetes security team, our open source community, for example, writing a load of kind of out of the box Kubernetes policies. I do think those things are happening. And I do think there's definitely we need to collaborate on this stuff kind of mindset. Maybe we're just not as good at marketing it as the baddies Twitter channels. Who knows? Maybe we need a DevSecOps like PR stunt or something.
Rachel, do you think the open source community is starting to rally around all this, or what's going on your side?
Yeah, I certainly do think there's a lot of good stuff happening. Like, we certainly see a lot more people doing container image vulnerability scanning in their CI pipeline, trying to catch stuff there. There's a lot more talk about, signing images so you can make sure those are verified. SBOMs are being talked about more and more. I think what's funny too is that, you don't see a news headline that says company A successfully had no one break into them. It's only the bad guys that have the headlines. And so that could be part of it too. Do we just fly under the radar for doing a good job when we do?
Somehow I knew this was all going to be my fault. Hey, guys, thanks for sharing your knowledge and insights. It's been great. I know Jared's got some housekeeping stuff he needs to take care of, and we need to also hand out some gift cards, maybe. I don't know if we have them for this one, but I think maybe. But anyway, Jared, take us home.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Mike. You guys all did an outstanding job. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us with the discussion and share your expertise. Just a quick reminder that today's session was recorded. Following the panel, you will receive an email with a link on how to access the recording in the on-demand version. In the event that you are not able to find that link or it doesn't come through to you, you can always go to our Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars. Look at the on-demand section where you can find it, and it will be waiting for you. Now, let's move on to our 4 gift card winners. We have Julie G, Sarah Z, Andrew H, and Jen A. Congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye out on your inbox to claim your gift card. If you don't receive it there, make sure to check your spam folder. Everyone, thank you again for taking the time to be with us. Unless anyone has any final remarks, I'd like to thank our audience for being with us for the entirety of today's presentation. And please take a moment to fill out the post-webinar survey as soon as the session ends, and we hope to see you in our upcoming TechStrong webinars. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.